Next on C-SPAN, we continue our American Profile series as we interview William Rusher, who's publisher of the National Review. This is one in a special series this week with prominent New Yorkers who talk about their work, their careers, and their fields.
Bill Rusher, publisher of the National Review. You've, over the years, I guess, communicated on a lot of different media. Which one, the print and radio and television and public speaking, do you think is the most effective?
Well, it depends for what purpose. To really say something carefully, to communicate it to another person deeply, it must be done in print, and commonly in book form, although a column occasionally can do it. But there's no question that just to get a short point across, there's nothing like television, never has been, and perhaps never will be. The direct contact of television is something that can't be beaten.
I remember you on The Advocates. What'd you think of that show?
I liked it very much. The Advocates almost combine the two things I've been talking about. In television, so often, there just isn't time. Typical panel show, half-hour long, 5 people. They ask you, well, Mr. Rusher, what's your opinion of that? And about the time you get your break, I'm sorry, Mr. Rusher, that's all the time we have. Or you go to the other guy, and it's very difficult to say much. In The Advocates, even there, the time pressure was considerable, but I at least had half an hour, roughly, to present my side of a case, and my opponent had the other half hour. And we each brought on 2 or 3 witnesses to state our side of the case. And we cross-examined the other guy's witnesses. And there was an opening statement and a closing statement. There was time to excavate an issue a little bit, although not enough, I'd have to say. But it was a lot better than any other time I've been able to spend on television. I can't imagine spending a television permitting anybody to spend much more because they're so against what they call talking heads anyway. You know.
When do you know you got the best of somebody in an argument, a confrontation, or an advocacy situation?
Usually when he is unable to come forward with a rational answer to a point or a question. That happens occasionally, and it's a great feeling when you know that there just is nowhere the poor devil can go. He's stuck.
Do you have a debate that you remember more than any other?
I have a number that I remember very fondly, but it wouldn't perhaps be fair to single out particular cases because they might state too much. Although, for example, I'm rather proud of the fact that I got Paul Samuelson, who was, I was cross-examining on The Advocates, who was a Nobel Prize-winning economist, to admit that he should have put something differently in, I think, the 8th edition of his book on economics. Because I had him there, and we had done our research, and he wished, and said he wished he'd put it differently.
Do you consider yourself a conservative? Is that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. What kind of a conservative? Let me ask you this before I do that. If you read Bill Saffir's column, which I'm sure you do from time to time, he's always talking about the difference between a traditional conservative and a libertarian conservative. Mm-hmm. Are you one or the other?
Yeah, I'm more of a traditional conservative. These terms are important, and it is important to use them carefully and precisely. But I don't blame people for wishing it were simpler, and for finally sometimes, if they're not deeply involved, saying, oh, the heck with it, I'm not going to get concerned. Yes, a libertarian conservative is only marginally a conservative. First and foremost, he is against government. Government of almost any type. An extreme libertarian doesn't want hardly anything done by the government. He sees very little reason for government. I have actually seen an article by a libertarian suggesting that taxes ought to be voluntary rather than compulsory. That's a libertarian, an extreme one. Traditional conservative of the standard variety in the United States since the end of World War II, at any rate, has been a person who has been highly skeptical that the Soviet Leopard was going to change its spots, and believed that we should keep a very sharp eye on them, resist their aggressions, build up our own defenses and maintain them. But here at home believed that in a rather, although not extremely libertarian way, that government was not the solution to all problems, that government trying to solve a problem very often made it worse, that the cure turned out to be worse than the disease, as for example in the welfare situation, where perfectly sincere liberal efforts to help our poor, and particularly our black poor, resulted through aid to families with dependent children and other programs in just about destroying the black family structure. A terrible thing to do, and a very good example of government barging in to do something and making the situation worse. Now, that's the kind of thing that we conservatives feel must be avoided.
Why, after all these years, are you retiring as publisher of the National Review?
30 years, or it will be 31 before I retire, at any job is surely enough. I've enjoyed every minute of it. I wouldn't have changed it for the world. We started out at a time when the conservative movement could have held its national convention in a phone booth without too much exaggeration. And we have lived to see it become one of the major political philosophies in the world today, subscribed to in general by Margaret Thatcher as well as Ronald Reagan, by the German Christian Democratic government of Helmut Kohl, by most of the major free world industrial nations. This is a wonderful thing to have seen. But there's a sense, too, in which the curtain has come down on that long-running and successful play. I don't mean that conservatism has stopped having its political effect. What I can do about it, I think I have done. I want to spend my time now, frankly, looking a little to the longer range, to some ideas that are not involved with this presidency or this decade even, but which have to do with even the 21st century. What ideas will be dominating mankind then? What solutions will we be looking to? Solzhenitsyn, in his Harvard commencement address in 1978, suggested that in some way we had to reintegrate our Judeo-Christian religious tradition with the ongoing intellectual tradition of the West. Pretty clearly, the effort to live without God has failed. Science is coming up against limitations that are more than just temporary. What's back there behind the Big Bang? It's not clear that we're ever going to know in scientific terms. Now, the question therefore becomes, I guess, where will we find our rights and our wrongs? And the intuition here is that we will find them where mankind has generally found them.
Where were you born? I'm sorry. I didn't mean to say that. Where were you born?
In Chicago. Midwesterner.
How long did you spend in Chicago?
7 years of my life. Then my father's business took him and us east, so that I was raised in the suburbs of New York City and went to school in the New York City public schools, and the Great Neck High School, Princeton University, Harvard Law School. But there's a streak of Midwest in me that's very real still.
Senator Moynihan went to the New York public schools also. What made the two of you at some fork go one way and one the other? You're about the same age.
I don't know. I know Pat Moynihan, but I don't know him well enough to talk about what drove him in those particular directions. I have no doubt at all that my own Midwestern background, my family's teachings to me, my father's particularly on patriotism and related subjects, influenced me. Oh, by the way, one other thing which had a part to play. It so happened, by sheer coincidence, that my mother's little hometown of Independence, Kansas, was also the hometown of Alf Landon. In 1936, when I was 13 years old, ran for president. Well, you know who I was for, and you know how badly we got licked. And I have a feeling that maybe the rest of my life has been an attempt to win that election.
What kind of a person was your father?
He was a salesman all his life. I met many years later a man who had once hired him as a salesman, said, "Your father could sell a pair of spectacles to a blind man." He was an impressive speaker and had a rather authoritative way about him. And I learned a certain amount about argumentation, I think, from him.
When did you first sense an interest in either the printed word or speaking or oratory? Or
quite early, when I was in high school, I think. I joined a little debating club called the Filibusters, and I also went to work for our high school paper and became the editor of that, co-editor of that in Great Neck. So from that point forward, I was interested in politics and in writing about politics. I didn't know whether I wanted to get into politics myself or simply be a writer about them, and I've staggered around on that question. I decided at one point that I wanted to be in politics, and I became a lawyer with that in mind. And then at age 33 about, after having been very active in young Republican and to some small degree local New York senior politics, I decided that it wasn't for me, that I was more interested in the ideas behind politics. And it was very shortly thereafter that I came to National Review and lived happily ever after.
what was the status of National Review when you joined it?
It had about 16,000 paying subscribers. It had been going for 17 months. Bill Buckley was already losing money with it hand over fist. But I felt that I was single, and I felt that I could take the chance that perhaps a man with a wife and children couldn't. I was then about 34, of going into a little project like that I believed in very deeply, and working with it, even if it didn't in the long run work out. Well, as it turned out, it worked out brilliantly well, and pretty soon they were saying, well, hey, could you make a speech for us, or we'll even pay you, or later on, come on the Advocates and represent the conservatives, or write a column, or write a book. We've had more chances than we really needed or wanted to shoot off our mouths.
This question sounds prejudicial, but has the National Review ever made any money?
Not in a serious way, no. Some years have been less money losing than others. Once we came within a hair's breadth of breaking even, but no, it's all journals of opinion in America. The Nation, the New Republic, the Commentary, National Review lose money.
Why?
And because they are designed not to make a profit, but to make a point. They would keep on going whether anybody wanted to read what they were writing or not. In a sense, they're a little bit like a church or a school or a political party. People give them money because they believe in what they're doing. And so a national journal of opinion is a bit like, National Review is a bit like a church or a school or a political party. It partakes some of the characters of all three.
How big a circulation do you have?
About 124,000 today. But we don't really try to run it up to huge figures. We haven't the slightest intention of trying to compete with Time magazine with 4 million or something like that. But National Review is much the largest of the journals of opinion in the United States. The New Republic has about, I think, 100,000. The Nation may have, what now, 80,000, something like that. Commentary, 40, 45,000. We have 124,000. But it isn't the numbers. It's who's reading it. It's the idea population, the people who are going to be writing the ideas that people will be thinking and hearing about tomorrow.
Over the years, can you look back and remember some of the places where an article had a real impact that you would, if you had plaques on the wall, you'd say, here's where we made a difference?
Yes, although it's a tough question because that kind of influence is not generally where somebody can photograph it, Out there, even today, there may be some young man or woman reading National Review, and the mind that is just ready for the ideas is being captured right now, and in 20, 30, 40 years may have tremendous impact. But how can we say that that is true now? How could we prove 40 years from now that it was true? But to answer your question, I know of one case, I know it because I was to some degree involved in it, in which a professor who studied these things, if I'm not mistaken, for the University of Illinois, put out a study and said that one specific case in which an article in a journal of opinion had had a definite impact in the world was an article that happened that I had written called, I've forgotten even the title of it now, but I know what it suggested. It was in 1963, and it suggested that Barry Goldwater had a very good chance against Kennedy, not against Johnson, because of course we didn't know Johnson would be the candidate, but against Kennedy of winning the presidency of the United States, that he could win votes in various areas like the South and the West where previously the Democrats had been terribly strong. And it argued this case by pointing out largely what had happened in the midterm elections of 1962. I know that article had a big effect. Among other things, it had an effect on Goldwater, who up until then had not taken his own candidacy very seriously, or the possibility of it. And then we issued reprints of that article, and Republican state and county leaders from around the country would order hundreds of copies, in some cases thousands of copies, to circulate among their people and their Republican colleagues. It became the largest selling reprint in the history of National Review. I forget, but something in the order of 25 or 30,000 reprint copies were sold. It was called Crossroads for the GOP. I remember now the title. And that article certainly had some material effect in establishing the real possibility of Goldwater as a candidate. Now, it's only fair to add that the fact that he did so poorly in 1964 was in very large part owing to circumstances that weren't and couldn't be taken into account in that article of mine in early 63. Kennedy was a liberal from the northeastern United States. Johnson was a relative conservative in democratic terms from the Southwest, and from the big state of Texas rather than the little state of Arizona. The very fact that he had succeeded a martyred, assassinated president spoke in favor of re-electing him and of not changing horses again in midstream, having 3 presidents in a little over 15 months, as it would have been. And then, too, the very fact that Goldwater was nominated so infuriated the relatively liberal, or moderate, as they would call themselves, Eastern Republicans, that they sat on their hands in many cases and didn't vote for Goldwater. So that there again was a sort of a side factor that injured his prospects. But Goldwater's, the basic idea of combining social conservatives in the South and the West with economic conservatives in the North, which were the core of the Republican Party, was a perfectly sound idea and was subsequently used by Richard Nixon against McGovern in 1972 when he won 49 states to 1, carried every state but Massachusetts, and by Reagan again when he won all but I think 5 states in 1980 and carried every state but Minnesota in 1984. It wasn't a bad idea. It was just that Goldwater could not, for the reasons I mentioned, realize its potentiality in 1964.
How about alumni? Are there a lot of old National Review alumni out there that have gone on to do things? I think of one that I can remember reading is George Will, but I'm sure there must be others.
There are many, many. May I mention President Reagan?
You can mention as many as you'd like.
He began reading National Review in 1960, and long before, 6 years before he ran for governor of California, and still reads it faithfully. I know he does because early in his administration, 1981, he asked Bill Buckley if Bill could make sure that he got a copy at the White House. He said, they have it on Air Force One, but he said it's still spotty around the White House. Sometimes I miss it. So Bill, knowing that I was the office compulsive who could be sure of doing a thing, asked me to make sure that a copy went to him. And there is a special way in which you can get materials destined for the president's eyes past all the security and to the desk of his immediate secretary. And that way was revealed to us, and that is the way his copy now goes. And on 4 or 5 occasions, it goes out usually on Monday. By Wednesday, I'll get a phone call from the president. He's seen that magazine and wants to say something about it.
How about people, though, that have written for you and gone on in either the world of politics or writing? I mean, let me ask you about George Will for a second.
Yes.
Wasn't he Cato?
George Will was our Washington correspondent and may have written, I've forgotten to tell you the truth, the Cato column, which is an anonymous or at least a pseudonymous column. He might have done that, but I'm inclined to think he didn't. But I think he wrote the byline column from Washington.
What about, why is a column called Cato?
Well, Cato is a column, as you know, that is designed not so much for long, deep thoughts as it is inside stuff. And you can sometimes say a little bit more if you say it from behind the pseudonym of an ancient Roman or something of that sort. It's a way of protecting the author, I think, a little bit. And then, I suppose, to some extent, the anonymous sources that he may quote.
Are there others like George Will that started at the National Review and went on?
Yes, and interestingly enough, they didn't all remain conservatives, you know. Garry Wills, whatever he is now, started at National Review. I'm not sure that he's easy to define at the moment. John Leonard, who is the television critic at the moment for New York Magazine, among other things, and is, broadly speaking, a liberal, started at National Review. In fairness, though, to both Wills and Leonard, Garry Wills and John Leonard, I don't think Bill Buckley asked either of them whether he was a conservative before he hired him. Bill is a fanatic about good writing, and if he reads something that somebody has written and likes it a lot, that person is quite likely to get an invitation to write for National Review, and then only later, if at all, will Bill get around and say, by the way, are you a conservative? In the case of Leonard and Wills, he liked the way they wrote and invited them to write, and they did write and wrote well, and later on went into journalism careers in which they either found it desirable or convenient to be more liberal.
Over the 31 years, how have you and Bill Buckley split up the responsibility?
It's worked out very well. We did it on a trial and error basis, so there are several divisions. Number one, Bill is the theoretician. Or not all, but many of his contacts are with the intellectual community, the writers, the philosophers, the professors. Mine were with the lawyers and the politicians. I was the House politician, God help me. Remember, I said that originally I had thought I wanted to go into politics as a career. And so when I decided I didn't, I nonetheless had the political contacts, and I was the one who sort of was the interface between National Review and the Draft Goldwater movement, or National Review and the Reagan movement, and that sort of thing. That was one role that I had, while Bill was taking care of the intellectuals. Then from time to time, Bill likes to, or is driven temperamentally, to do something that is not all that conservative, you know. I call them his little lost leaders. He comes out for the decriminalization of marijuana, or he endorses Al Lowenstein for Congress, or he calls for letting Abby Hoffman off some prison sentence. I disagree with him on all these things. I do not believe in decriminalizing marijuana. I was perfectly glad to be a friend of Al Lowenstein's, but never crossed my mind that on that account I had to endorse him for Congress, where he would vote against everything I was for. And I thought Abby Hoffman ought to go right ahead and serve his little sentence. And I say so. I've never felt that working with Buckley required me to agree with him on everything. So when we do have that kind of a division, sort of a yang and a yin in the magazine, I generally turn out to be the one who writes the replies to the outraged subscribers who write in saying to Buckley, have you gone out of your mind, you know? And I say, no, Mr. Buckley hasn't gone out of his mind, he's just temporarily taken leave of it, or something like that.
Does he own the magazine completely?
Yes, he owns the entire voting stock, and thank goodness he or some one person does. Nothing will destroy certainly a journal of opinion, and perhaps any other human enterprise, faster than dividing up the authority on how it shall go. If you want one good example, look at the government of the United States trying to pick a foreign policy in the Persian Gulf with, as the President has said, 535 secretaries of state. In the case of Journal of Opinion, it may not matter whether you go one way or another on a particular issue, whether we support Dole or Bush or Kemp. but that somebody shall have the decision, the power to say we will do thus and so, is terribly important. Because otherwise everybody feels they have to get into the act and has to die on the barricades for their particular beliefs, whereas many times I've been able to say, well, I think Buckley is wrong about this, but he owns the voting stock. And he in turn thinks he has won the argument when he hasn't won the argument. He's merely owned the voting stock, that's all.
Victor Navasky, the editor of The Nation, told us in our conversation with him about the situation there, where Mr. Carter, who owns it, negotiated with Vic Navasky over a period of a couple of weeks on where the editorial control rested. And I asked him the question about what if Mr. Carter came into him and said, do this or do that, and Vic Navasky looked up as if to say there's not a chance that he could have anything to say about the editorial content. Could something like that ever happen at National Review, where you have, I mean, do you understand that separation of ownership and editorial control?
Well, I know it happens, and I know it has happened in the case of The Nation now, and that it contains a potential for trouble. It couldn't happen at National Review because the editor-in-chief owns the stock, so all he has to do is agree with himself, and he manages to do that very well.
I guess the question I would have for you is, what do you think of that kind of an arrangement when you hear about it?
Well, I hardly worry about it deeply in the case of The Nation, since anything bad that happens to The Nation it may benefit America in the long run, in my opinion. But leaving that aside, it is obviously a problem. It's going to be a problem. It isn't necessarily an insuperable problem. Sometimes the editor can get the chip off his shoulder and talk with the publisher or owner of the stock and come to some agreement. Sometimes the owner of the stock very often he has the sense to leave his editor alone. But at the last, there's no question about it, the man who owns the stock has to take the ultimate responsibility for what's in the publication, and I don't see how he can avoid being interested in what that is.
You got a new book coming out?
Yes, I do. Excuse my hoarseness, by the way, in case it's apparent. I have a cold I've had for a week or so. Yes, at the end of March, I have a book coming out called The Coming Battle for the Media, which is, as the name suggests, a discussion of the media in this country and what I believe is their obvious, long-time liberal bias. The major media, the media elite I'm talking about now, not some little weekly out in Nebraska. And it's being published by Morrow, and I think it will attract a certain amount of attention. Although you never can tell. When Robert and Linda Lichter published a book called The Media Elite a couple of years ago, with great statistical care, they're both PhDs, studying the bias in the media. The New York Times and the Washington Post never reviewed it at all. It just disappeared down a black hole there. That might happen to my book, but I doubt it, because it's a little more quarrelsome, a little feistier. It may grab their interest a little bit more. But it sets out to cite examples of bias. It then goes about proving statistically that the members of the media elite are well to the left of American public opinion in general. It then goes on to prove equally statistically, but separately, that the way the things they believe actually influence their news product. It discusses their responses to criticism. It discusses some of the things that have been thought of to try to monitor them a little bit internally or externally, the Fairness Doctrine, the National News Council, of which I was a member for years. It discusses their alleged legal privileges and immunities, most of which don't exist, except in their own minds and columns. And also, and this is, I think, one of the most interesting chapters, sets forth an imaginary scenario in which an American invasion of Nicaragua bogs down in part because of media coverage which is intensely negative and which eventually confronts the president with a Congress unwilling to, under the War Powers Act, vote him the power to continue the attack. And he in turn quite explicitly threatens censorship. He does not feel that he has been elected president to see a military operation, which is still supported in my fictional presentation by a narrow majority of the people, simply prevented by media. And I kind of leave it in a Lady or the Tiger ending as to what happens then. This is a very serious and real problem. I think it could happen tomorrow.
Is it a legal? Is it a legal problem? Do the media organizations you're talking about have a legal? Let's say you're right. Have a legal responsibility to be balanced or more objective, in your opinion?
Not that I know of. In my scenario, in that chapter, they argue, well, what if this is the way we feel? Don't we have the right to feel this way and say so? And of course, under the First Amendment, as interpreted at any rate by many people, they do, but as the President points out, there are other things besides the First Amendment. The First Amendment begins, Congress shall make no law. Now, the President goes on in my scenario to point out that it doesn't say the President shall not, as Commander-in-Chief, have certain authorities. And we have always had military censorship in our country. So they may not have the right to destroy an ongoing military operation of the United States.
Where do you see the liberal bias the most obvious? Where is it the most obvious to you?
Well, the most work on it has been done in the statistical work now I'm talking about in the evening news programs of the three major commercial networks. Lord knows that isn't the only place, and I cite examples from many other places. But that is a spectacular example. Edith Ephron wrote a book after she had studied the reports in 1968 on those of the election for the last, I think, 3 months of the election on all three of those networks. And she did simply a word count of pro and con coverage. And I think that in the case of one network, that the words hostile to Nixon outnumbered those favorable to him 6-1. In another case, 9-1. And in the winning case, if that's what it was, over 16-1. This is over the entire period. That's kind of hard to just make go away.
Is this something that you've wanted to write about for a long time? This is not new, is it?
No, it is something that, you see, I was a lawyer for 9 years in private practice before I turned to a life of crime and became a magazine publisher. And in private practice, 7.5 years in a Wall Street law firm, and then 1.5 years as associate counsel to the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee in Washington. But I was trained as a lawyer. And now, after 30 years as a magazine publisher, I kind of have both points of view, but you never get the law completely out of a man, even though he's been out of the practice of law that long. I still look at many questions more, I think, with the eye of a lawyer than of a newspaperman.
Over the last 5 or 6 years, we've had over 1,000 print journalists on our morning call-in program, and the question about liberal bias is brought up almost daily by one of the callers. It's probably not fair to characterize every answer as being the following, but most reporters say that they may or may not be liberal, but their reporting is objective. Would you dispute that?
I certainly would. I realize that it's a different argument. In pure theory, they could concede that the statistical evidence that they are liberals is valid, and yet it doesn't affect their work product. But as Fred Barnes pointed out in the New Republic not long ago, that very argument would be rejected, first of all, by the media if it were used on anybody's behalf but their own. Suppose Union Carbide said, well, yes, it's true that we have interests in South Africa, but we don't let that interfere with our corporate attitudes, and you shouldn't take it into account in whether or not you should divest from our stock. It would be laughed out of court in any newspaper in the country, because of course a man's economic interest is supposed to influence his general attitudes. If a judge said, yes, it's true that I own a lot of General Motors stock, but I won't let that interfere with my decision in this case, how far would he get? How far would he get to the media? And yet the media say, well, yes, it's true that the one study demonstrates, I think, quite clearly that in the 4 presidential elections of 1964, 68, 72, and 76, never less than 80% of a random selection of the people in the media elite voted for the Democratic candidate. And we are supposed to believe that this does not affect their work product, particularly when we see the work product, particularly when we see what they do with it. You know, these people are on the air. As I've said, how do you get the results in the case of Nixon or other studies that were made of their handling of Reagan?
What do you say then to the argument that if, let's assume that they are liberal, but what good does that do because Ronald Reagan was elected twice to president?
I think it's a very valid, or at least put this way, it's a saving grace. Thank heaven, if they're going to be as biased as they are, that the American people, as you say, forever phoning in on these talk shows to denounce them as the slanted producers that they are. The American people are not quite that easy to fool, and thank goodness they're not.
They have no power then?
Who, the media?
Yeah.
No, they have enormous power. But it's selective and it depends. They have more power in certain cases than others. I happen to cite very early in my book the case of a boast by Richard M. Cohen, who is director of all foreign news for the CBS Evening News. He's complaining in an op-ed piece in the New York Times that we should pull out all of our journalists from South Africa because they are not allowed anymore to photograph riots there. And he tells with great enthusiasm and relish how he used to photograph the riots and how he would use the tight, close-in shots to heighten the intensity of the point. And he said it is possible with television to form and maintain the consciousness of the American people. Well, of course it is. Of course it is. And Mr. Cohen is doing it, and he's delighted that he's doing it. And in the case of South Africa, you may or may not agree with what he's doing, but he's not only doing it in the case of South Africa. He's doing it in the case of South Korea. He's doing it in the case of the United States. He's doing it in the case of the Democratic Party. And I think that we have every right to say that that is not balanced, that is not fair, and it should not be the performance of these media. Certainly, they should not have all of the special privileges that they request and demand, legally and otherwise.
Why?
If all they're going to do is slant their news.
Why has the media, and you can refute this if you don't, but it seems like if you're just a casual viewer, that you would pick up the fact that they're very anti-Gary Hart's return into this thing.
Well, I don't know that they're yet anti-Gary Hart. They're certainly giving him a lot of coverage. I think that they may have felt, to the extent that they're anti-Gary Hart, and I really am not sure that they are, but if they are, maybe they feel that they got him good and proper before, and he didn't have the common decency to lie down and stay dead. And they're going to have to drive another stake through his heart, and this time make it stick. That may be the explanation, but I'm not sold that they are yet anti-Hart. I think they can. What they're doing is just giving him lots of rope and seeing what he does with it.
Who are? I'm not sure this is a good question, but who are your heroes? Who over your lifetime have you look back on and you say that's my idol, or maybe hero is a bad term? People I respect, people I follow, writers, politicians.
Well, for different purposes and at different times in my life. I remember my father saying to me when I was 16 and very much admired Winston Churchill. He said, well, if you have to have a hero, I guess you've picked a good one. I think young people need heroes most. As we get older, we tend to get a little more jaded and a little less needful of heroes to follow around, at least I have. But I'll tell you this, without in any serious sense hero worshiping him, I, much more than many of my fellow conservatives at the moment, have still a tremendous regard for Ronald Reagan. I have had the privilege of knowing him since shortly after he became governor. I used the fact that I was the publisher of a magazine that he read and liked to get in and to meet him and to know him. And when he was governor, I was able to visit him and Nancy in Sacramento and have dinner with them half a dozen times, just the three of us. And I got to feel that I understood him pretty well. Now, since he's been president, as I said, I can't bring myself to phone a president of the United States. It's a weakness, I guess. But he has phoned me, and we've kept in touch that way, and by the occasional letter. But I think this is a much tougher, wiser, more persistent man than he is currently being given credit for. And I think he will loom very large indeed in our history. I don't worry that conservatives are impatient with him now. All the younger ones, to begin with, can't remember, by comparison, Eisenhower and Nixon. They don't know how good they have it now. They don't realize they're living in the golden age. And then there are things, of course, that he has not done to total satisfaction, certainly not even to his total satisfaction. But as a student of politics and as a student of conservatism, I will have to say that I am constantly stunned by the ability and the persistence and the quality of this man's performance. I think it is very high.
What's your reaction to people that have been around him who've been indicted for different reasons, I know, but what's that all about?
Well, you put your finger on indictment, which I, as a lawyer, like, because that gives us something specific to talk about. The press is much fonder of saying, 100 people have left the White House under a cloud. Under a cloud. But let's talk about indictments. Ray Donovan was indicted. And what? Acquitted, right? And he says, where is the window that I go to get back my reputation? He's one of the men who was indicted. Mike Deaver has been indicted. He has not yet been convicted. But even there, and Deaver is a very easy man for many people to dislike. When he came out of the White House, the number of people waiting around with knives for Mike Deaver was frightening to any observer, if not to him. He may not have realized how many enemies he had made. But
you didn't mean to say that he's already been convicted of the perjury.
I said he has not been. He has been indicted.
No, he's been convicted. Are you thinking of Len Nofziger?
Wait a minute, I beg your pardon. Yes, he has now been convicted. That's correct. I'm sorry. I simply misspoke. He has now been convicted. That's true. But let me say with regard to that, what I wanted to say was this. What he was convicted of wasn't, you might be interested to know, the Ethics in Government Act violation at all. He was convicted of perjury for denying that he could remember having spoken to Bud McFarlane, the National Security Council director, about some corporations that wanted a tax advantage to continue in Puerto Rico, who had hired him as their lobbyist. Why did they convict him of that? Because if they were going to convict him under the Ethics in Government Act, they would have had to prove corrupt intent, which apparently they didn't think they could prove. They would have had to have gone to a much more elaborate demonstration of guilt than was possible by just picking on this one little denial. Deaver, another thing, too, that annoys me about the Ethics in Government Act is it doesn't even apply to congressmen. When the Congress passed the Ethics in Government Act, they carefully excluded themselves. If a member of the executive branch goes out and within a year lobbies his old agency, he violates the Ethics in Government Act and goes to prison. If a congressman goes out and does exactly the same thing, he gets a big fat fee. Is that fair? Is there any ethics in Congress? Apparently not.
Let me go back to the Mike Deaver thing. Yeah. What I was really going to ask you about is that, for a lot of years, there were a lot of articles that Mike Deaver was the man making all the decisions around the president. He went out, was indicted, got a lot of criticism for publicity that he got and all that. I guess what I was really kind of backing into is want to know from you whether you think all along the president was the one making all these strategic PR decisions, or whether you thought the aides around him were.
No, I think Deaver was a very good PR man and, for example, planned the trip to Normandy at the time of the anniversary of the invasion of Normandy and so on. It was all Deaver's work, and very good work, too. No, I think he did do a lot of negative things to a lot of people, no question about it, and they remember it and they resent it. I know some of them, and I know some of the things that were done. And they were infighting, mean things. He had a lot of enemies, but that doesn't mean that he was fairly, in my opinion, convicted. In the case of Lynn Noffsinger, I think it's much worse. Lynn Noffsinger, who has not yet been convicted, has been indicted of that under that same provision, the Ethics in Government Act this time. Is a man who never wanted to be in government at all. I said one time when he said he was leaving, and indeed packed up everything and put it in the car and headed west with Bonnie, his wife, I said to him, Lynn, why are you leaving? Oh, he said, Bill, I'm not an organization man. He said, I don't like government. And I think it was true of him. I think he hasn't been convicted, and he may not be. If he is, I think it'll be a tragedy. Because there was never, unlike Deaver, never anyone who wasn't, I think, fond of Lynn Noffsinger, and I think he's a perfectly honorable man.
Why are conservatives so upset with the president? What do you see that they don't see?
Well, to begin with, not all of them are upset with the president. It turns out to be a lot easier to get your name in the Washington Post if you're ready to attack President Reagan than it is to get your name in the Washington Post if you're ready to support President Reagan. Huh? And let's not forget that. And the media had Howie Phillips on, calling the president a useful idiot, and saying even his most loyal supporters are attacking him. And then they go to Howie Phillips. Now, Howie Phillips has been attacking Ronald Reagan, to my personal knowledge, for at least 5 years. He and Richard Viguerie did their level best to get someone to run against him from the right in 1984 and oust him from office. And yet it is treated as news that these men were opposed to him after the INF Treaty was signed. I think that's just the media doing what the media do so well. But there are others involved. There is a whole group around Nixon and Kissinger who have opposed, or at any rate had deep reservations about the INF Treaty. I think that they are to some degree entitled to credence as serious reservations, but I can't help feeling too that there is a sense in which both Nixon and Kissinger are trying to get around Ronald Reagan's right flank here a bit, to be more conservative than Reagan for purposes of their own historical reputation. After all, they negotiated and signed most of the treaties which have turned out as badly as they have, and which we are now regretting as deeply as we do. Solzhenitsyn had an article in 1981, I think, in Foreign Affairs, in which he called the Kissinger Syndrome, which he said, I call it that, although Mr. Kissinger is not the only one who suffers from it. He said, these are people who, when they are in office, make compromises for which the West will pay dearly. And then when they get out of office, suddenly the scales fall from their eyes, and they begin being the worst critics of any arrangements. Now, I think this is the case with Kissinger and Nixon, and then they've got Scowcroft and Eagleburger and Bill Hyland and a little clique of people who go with them and are following their lead in this respect. There are other conservatives who have perfectly sincere, serious reservations about the INF Treaty. I can understand those. I myself think that on balance it's a good idea.
The last few minutes, would you help us better understand the different publications, the specialty publications, and give us a quick, maybe 10, 15 second reaction to them and how they fit in this spectrum? The Human Events, how does it relate to National Review?
Human Events is a Washington, Capitol Hill-oriented conservative tabloid, weekly that certainly nobody can question its doughty conservatism. It is not, I think it's fair to say, as widely read by intellectual circles as National Review. It doesn't carry as much design to be read by those. It's more concentrated on Capitol Hill and what's going on there.
Same conservatism that National Review is?
Roughly the same. Traditional non-libertarian conservatism, yes.
How about the American Spectator?
American Spectator, again, is in the main line of conservative publications. It has a lot the temperament of its founder and editor, Bob Tyrrell, who is a wonderfully argumentative, bright, flashy young man, and has done very well. I read it and enjoy it enormously.
How about The Nation, which is obviously on the other side? You
Nation is a serious left publication, and as such, I think, would deserve to be considered as doing serious harm to this country, because I think leftism and the policies of the left do serious harm to this country, except for the fact that I don't think that they have an awful lot of following anymore. At one time in our history, The Nation was one of the publications on the left that really called a lot of the shots.
What about the New Republic?
New Republic was another at one time. The New Republic has been at one time or another all over the lot. Henry Wallace, in his worst period, was at one point, I think, editor or something like that of the New Republic. But right now, the New Republic is a lot of fun to read because I haven't the foggiest idea when I pick it up where it's going to be. It had an attack on Ted Kennedy not long ago that I wish and will wish until my dying day had run in National Review instead. It has a lot of stuff in it that is not anymore specifically liberal at all. And it has some that is. Now, what you pay for this, you pay your money and take your choice. Or in one of Emerson's great quotations, "What wilt thou have, saith the Lord, take it and pay for it." If you want to be unpredictable, which Lord knows the New Republic is, okay, then you can be unpredictable, but you will tend also to be incoherent to some extent. The New Republic simply cannot, the things that are there cannot be fitted, even most of them, into some one line of logical thought. They're all over the place. They disagree with each other, which is fun.
All right, newspapers, editorial pages, and philosophy. Quickly, what do you read on a daily basis?
Well, certainly the New York Times. One has to. It has this enormous coverage. You've got to be very careful that it will make certain things disappear altogether, and it will emphasize things that it wants to run into the ground and understress others that it should give much more emphasis to. But
what's its philosophy?
In terms of, it is a specifically and highly liberal publication, although from time to time, since it's a very large publication, you will get ideas and tendencies in it that are not necessarily liberal. Well-written editorial philosophy? No, I think it's kind of stuffy, frankly. I don't think that anybody would regard the New York. It is not ungrammatical. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that New York Times style is not anything that I think most people would pad around trying to imitate. At least Wall Street Journal? Wall Street Journal, particularly on the here you've got to make a big distinction between the news pages of the Wall Street Journal and its Washington Bureau, particularly under Al Hunt, which is a knee-jerk liberal operation, and its editorial pages under Bob Bartley in New York, which are the best editorial pages in all the media elite. Washington Post. Washington Post is a very powerful publication because of it's located in Washington. And it is in many ways, although not all, a good newspaper. But it is the most relentlessly liberal of all the major newspapers in the United States, and I am proud to sit on the editorial advisory board of the Washington Times, that little publication that only has about 100,000 readers down there, but which presents a conservative viewpoint in rivalry to the Post. What do you think of their editorial positions, the Times? The Washington Times? It's a perfectly standard conservative editorial viewpoint. Arnaud de Borgrave is a perfectly wonderful editor and runs a very tight ship there. If I thought there was anything wrong with the Times, I would not be on its editorial advisory board, I'll tell you that. 3 minutes. Your candidate for president. I've told, well, the ones I know best, Bush, Dole, and Kemp, that I'm in the position of Mark Twain, who said he didn't care whether he went to heaven or hell because he had friends in both places. I don't think, frankly, that there one needs to necessarily pick among those. The conservative movement has come to a point where everybody running for the Republican nomination says with a good deal of plausibility that he is a conservative. And I think you can play favorites among them as you choose. I happen to think that any one of the candidates that we see there running for the nomination would make an excellent president, certainly a better one than anybody the Democrats are likely to put up.
Can you give us your idea of what you think will be the turn in this country over the next term, next 4 years?
Well, that's likely to depend on the economy. But here, I guess I might as well spend my last few minutes to say one thing that sometimes gets overlooked. Don't count the conservative movement out, merely because some of its members are now angry with Reagan, even if the Republicans lose the election. The conservative movement is here to stay. It is a much bigger thing than a flash in the pan. It has think tanks, legal foundations, journalism, training schools, candidates, managers, spokesmen, you name it. It's ready for the long haul, and it is going to be heard, thank heaven, as a voice in the future of this country.
Anybody on the other side of the fence that you would most like to run against if you were supporting a Republican candidate?
You don't mean me, but
no, I mean
to have the Republican. Yes, I kind of hope the Democrats finally run Mario Cuomo, because it would be fun, because he would be vigorous, because he is an all-out liberal, and because licking him would prove something, therefore. Whereas with most of them, I don't think licking them would prove anything, except that there wasn't much there to begin with.
On that note, Bill Rush, you're publisher of the National Review. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Join C-SPAN this evening for 2 more American Profile interviews. Beginning at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll bring you a conversation with Rudolph Giuliani, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Then at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 Pacific, we'll spend an hour with John Phelan, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the New York Stock Exchange. Both men talk about their careers, their fields, and their outlooks on society.